Hi, everyone. Hope that you all are doing well. Welcome to our webinar. Don't get written off by write-offs. So just a quick kind of show of hands, make sure you can all hear me and that everything is working well. Could you go ahead and say where you're from in the chat feature of Zoom? It would be nice to get a sense of who's on the line and where you're all from. Oh, fun. Great. Looks like we've got some folks from Oklahoma. We've got some folks from California. Oh, San Francisco Bay Area. I love that area. Juneau. Patty, hi there from NACDC. Luke. Oh, it's so fun to see so many friends' names pop up here. Well, great. Looks like we're all there. Just some kind of webinar courtesies. You guys are now, I see that you're masters of the chat feature, so that's great. Also, there's also a question and answer feature here where you can pose questions as we go along. And we have our awesome tech support here today who will be making sure that we see those questions and if we have any things come up. So appreciate that, but you will all be on mute through this unless we use those chat features, and then we can choose to unmute you if you have a question you'd like to ask, or just go ahead and ask in that Q&A. So Brian, you can put up that slide of our beautiful faces if you'd like. So welcome. You are in the fine company of Team Oweesta here. We are blessed to have our amazing lending team, which they've allowed me to tag on to today, to talk about the write-offs and loan loss reserve process. Many of us, of course, with COVID-19 are thinking, how to protect our portfolio and how do we adjust our loan loss reserves? How do we approach write-offs in an appropriate way in accounting, but also, how do we account for potential losses that we're going to have? So this is a really, we decided to have this very timely conversation for us all to have, and I do hope we can have it be a conversation. But joining and leading the conversation today is our amazing Chief Finance Officer, Florence Ledka, myself, Crystal Langholtz, I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Oweesta, and then Alexander Shaughnessy, our Loan Officer. So thanks for joining us, and it's nice to have so many friends on the line. That's the purpose of one of the things that we're going to do on this webinar. In order to talk really well about the write-off process and about the loan loss reserve process, is to we kind of have to do a little bit of level setting around the loan loss reserve and how it functions, and best practices with it. So we are going to be talking through today, what is it? How does the loan loss reserve work? And talk a little bit about having an accrued loan loss reserve versus a cash reserve. What are the differences, and how exactly does an accrued loan loss reserve work on our financial statements? We're also going to talk through a loan loss reserve policy, which is to say, what should be in your loan loss reserve policy, what are the features of it, what are the kind of best practices of good loan loss reserve policies that we see. Also running through how is it calculated, when is it calculated, why is it important, but really going to try to be looking at those things through the lens of COVID-19. So not only kind of level setting around the loan loss reserve itself, but also, how will we be adjusting that process and what we're reserving in light of COVID-19. So next slide, please. So what is a loan loss reserve? So a loan loss reserve is really an estimate of the amount of losses that you're likely to see in the loans in your portfolio. So anybody who's been lending for more than 5 minutes know that when you make a loan, let's say you have $1 million loan portfolio, that the reality is for most of us is that we won't see all that come back to us, right? Maybe we'll only see 975,000 come back. We're going to only see a portion of that come back. So what a loan loss reserve allows us to do is to accurately reflect the value of our portfolio on our balance sheet. So it says, okay, we lent $1 million, but what we actually expect to come back to us is that 975,000, whatever that amount is, that accurate value of our portfolio. The other thing that a loan loss reserve does that's pretty crucial, especially in this time, is it allows us to smooth losses on our income statement over time. So if we have a big, if we're seeing increased write-offs, if we're seeing write-offs, particularly of a big loan, if we have been doing our loan loss reserve process correctly, we will have slowly felt that increase over time, so that when we actually have to go to make a big write-off, or a series, unfortunately, of big write-offs, that we're prepared to do that in such a way that it's not going to hit our income statement all at once. So it's smoothing those losses as we increase our loan loss reserve over time. The other thing that we want to, we'll talk a little bit about, which is important, is to say that an accrued loan loss reserve is not the same as your cash reserve. The accrued loan loss reserve is about accurately valuing the value of our portfolio on our balance sheets. It's a function much like depreciation on our balance sheets. And we're going to, if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so this slide, we have the things here. On one side, we have the accrued loan loss reserve and what it is. So that's the valuation reserve maintained to cover your losses in your portfolio that are probable and reasonably expected. We talked about it shows the value of the balance sheet, and it's an accounting adjustment you do. And Flo, our CFO, is going to surely walk you through that and talk about how you do that accounting adjustment. And it's based on kind of an expected scenario that you would see. Now, a cash reserve is a cushion against potential possible losses, but it actually represents cash in the bank. And the cash reserve is especially helpful in a worst case scenario, which of course is what we are all potentially experiencing right now. But the purpose of a cash reserve in many cases, a lot of funders or investors will require you to have one to make sure that you meet your investor covenants and those sorts of things. But they are separate, and they're not inherently or intrinsically linked. The next slide. And so just to give us some important critical factors here for what's in generally a loan loss reserve policy. Now, just to clarify, a loan loss reserve policy is most often going to be in your actual loan policies themselves, although I have seen groups that maintain a policy that's separate or an addendum in some way to their existing loan policies. But the kind of important things that a loan policy will do include it asks the questions of how, who, and when is the loan loss reserve going to be governed. So with the questions of how, the thing that it's going to be looking at is setting the initial risk rating. How is that determined? So what are the factors that are part and parcel of how you're evaluating your risk? So, traditional ones that we see, for example, in the small business space would include the credit score, how long the person's been in business. What are those factors that give us our initial risk rating? It also talks about with the how, how do we make adjustments to that? Is it when they're delinquent at 60 days? It's when they're delinquent at 90 days? how are we making those adjustments? Is that when, we're seeing potentially big regional factors that might come in, such as the collapse of an industry? What are the kinds of things that are being factored into our determination of when we make our adjustments? And it also will set the loan loss provision. So for the amount, so for when you do a rating, and we'll talk more about this, but it's also going to give us the amount for what our loan loss provision will be. On the who fronts, the board of directors should be approving your loan loss reserve policy. It's often developed in consultation with your loan committee. Although there are some procedural aspects of it that happen operationally as well, but it will also tell you who's preparing the risk ratings in your organization and who's approving them. So for example, if you need to make critical adjustments to your loan loss reserve, is that something that your lending committee approves? Is that something that your board approves? Is that something that your lending team internally has the ability to approve? So it's going to tell you who is in charge of those things. And also who does the loan loss reserve allocations on your staff, on your team, right? Is it the lending officer? Does that happen in the finance department? For many of us with small organizations, there's not a whole lot of who's to pick from, but you do want to have an identified person because as my dear friend Emily used to say, everyone's job is no one's job, right? So you would include that in there as well. And then I think in some cases, most critically, when do we do those? So in general, of course, you do your initial, you will do your initial setting of the loan loss reserve when you do your risk rating. So that's upon closing and disbursement. But also, when are we making adjustments? And we get a lot of questions about when is the best time to make adjustments. The purpose, of course, of an accrued loan loss reserve is to accurately value your financial statements. And so most CDFIs we work with, are preparing at least quarterly financial statements for their board to review and to go out to external funders. And so we recommend, adjustments need to be made at least quarterly. But many groups, make those adjustments more regularly on a monthly basis. And then also the question of when are they reviewing the system? And we recommend for that it be made at least annually. Anything to add from our from Alexandra or Flo about the loan policy, the loan loss reserve policy?
I think you did a great job, Crystal. I don't have anything to add.
Awesome. Love to hear. Great. Next slide, Brian.
Okay. Thank you so much, Crystal. Hi, everyone. So just to build off of what Crystal just discussed with the policy, so the who, when, and how, I just want to present a couple of things to keep in mind when you're developing and adjusting your policy. So for one thing, make sure to educate your board and your loan committee. I mean, these are the people who will be reviewing your policy and approving your loans. So it's important that everyone is on the same page and they all understand why your policy and your risk ratings are the way that they are. People have different experience levels and thought processes. So education is the best route to go. In the end, it'll prevent miscommunication and potential problems in the future. Next, set up a system that makes sense for your market and your loan products. So ensure you're creating or adjusting your policy for you and your community. While you can use others' examples to get started and kind of lay the framework, make sure not to just accept that as the standard. Look at it critically and ask yourself, does this make sense for my CDFI? And does it make sense for the times? Doing this will give you a policy that really works for you and isn't just in there for show. Next, an important step is to put it into your written policy. overall, this just helps with consistency, training, and the review process. You know, it helps make sure that everyone is on the same page and doing the same thing when they're working on your accounts in your loan portfolio. Also, it's very helpful if you have new staff or people that are just starting to work on your loan loss reserves. It acts as a training tool as well as a guide that they can use while they're going through your portfolio and adjusting to these rapidly changing times. Also, writing it down helps when your board or your auditors or anyone else reviews it. And it'll also help you, identify certain shortcomings. You can see kind of where it doesn't make sense and make adjustments as you need. Next, make sure you're following your own policy. Your policy can't help you if you're not using it. To make sure you're doing the best thing for your CDFI, make sure you're following the policies you created to safeguard your future and your survival during this tough time. Don't have it just for show or just because your board members want it. Make sure it's something you'll use. Next, try not to over-reserve or under-reserve. Both of these things only hurts you in the long run. We'll cover this more in the presentation and give you more details about the shortcomings of doing either of those things, but just keep it in mind. You're creating and maintaining your accrued reserve to make sure it's accurate and the correct estimate for your current conditions. And finally, an important thing is to evaluate your system. Constantly evaluate the system and make sure it works the way you want it to. If some problems come up, reevaluate it and keep updating it as you need to. It's a continual process with lots of moving parts, and it's affected by changes in time, your portfolio, your CDFI, and I think we can all agree that we're noticing that a lot more with the craziness going on. I think we can go to the next slide if no one else has anything to add. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we've covered policy. Now, how do we calculate your loan loss reserve? Remember, as Crystal said earlier, the reserve estimates the amount of losses that are likely to result from all loans in your portfolio. And the best way to estimate this is to look at your recent year's loan losses and the current state of loans in your portfolio. So a good thing to remember is the best predictor of the future is your most current past. So this will help you get the most accurate estimate that you can. And after you determine that, you can also work after your framework. You'll also need to consider risk factors of the loan. For instance, late payments or credit scores, anything that could make the loan a higher risk to you and your CDFI. But you should also consider the credit protections. This includes collateral, loan guarantees, things like that. Items that make the loan more secure and less risky for your organization. After you determine those factors, you assign your risk rating. And with that risk rating, it informs what percentage of your loan that you'll put into your loan loss reserve. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. All right, so we talked how to calculate it. The next step is to create your risk rating rubric and rating criteria, which we have an example of here. This will help you identify very clearly which loans are at greater or lesser risk. And with that, you can allocate a certain percentage of the loan amount to your reserve. And you can allocate less of a percentage for less risky loans and vice versa. So when you're developing this rating criteria and assessing your risk, it's important to look at these key indicators. For one thing, identify risk factors of your loans. Also look at trends in your market or your loan portfolio. And finally, ask yourself what things are relevant to your market and your products. After you determine that, just remember to keep it simple and usable. You know, you're going to be using this on every loan you do, so make sure that's feasible for you and your organization. And again, as we mentioned before, reevaluate it consistently for anything that changes. So as you can see, this rubric is made of your risk rating, your rating criteria, and your allocation percentage. So after you get all your documents for your loan review and underwriting due diligence, you're able to use this rubric to easily assign a risk rating and take the guesswork out of it. As a result, you can determine your loan loss reserve allocation percentage with more ease and consistency. So if, for instance, you're reviewing a loan that has no late payments, you know, the loan client has a strong portfolio and is always in compliance, you can reasonably give that a 1 and assign that percentage for your loan loss reserve. And you can do the same for any of the other ratings there. We can go to the next slide if no one needs to add anything. Okay, so on the previous slide, we reviewed our allocation table and risk rating rubric. So now you can apply it to the loans in your portfolio. Here we have an example of a simplified portfolio. As you can see, we assigned all the different loans with different risk ratings based on their different financial profiles. Once that's done, you can calculate how much we should have in our loan loss reserve. So for example, if you look at loan number 1, that one was $15,000. And after reviewing, we gave it a risk rating of 2. And that will tell us that in our best estimate and our best practice is to reserve 3.5% of that. So then that'll convert to dollars. So we'll put $525 into our loan loss reserve. And you do that for each of the loans in your portfolio. And it'll give you the total amount that you should have in your loan loss reserve based on your best estimate. So another reminder when you're looking at this, make sure that it makes sense for what's going on right now. And if it doesn't, reevaluate and adjust as needed. So best practice in general is to make adjustments quarterly. So when you're reviewing your quarterly financial statements for submission or anything like that, it's best to also take a look at your loan loss reserve to see if it's the right amount, if it fits with your estimates, all those sorts of things. If you don't have time for that or things get crazy, kind of like they are now, at minimum, make adjustments annually just to make sure it's not out of date and that it's not doing you any good. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is showing our rating rubric, but this is after COVID-19. So we've adjusted the existing rating system to incorporate, you know, current events and economic hardship. As you can see, we added a crisis rating at 10%. So this crisis rating allows us to prepare our portfolio for increased losses and allocate more funds to our reserve. When modifying your allocation and ratings, you want to make sure to identify new key risk factors, because those may be different than the ones you used before, and ask yourself, how is COVID-19 affecting your business and your loans and your community? Because that's going to be different across many CDFIs. So, for instance, when Oweesta was looking at its loan loss reserve and seeing how we needed to adjust it thanks to COVID-19, we looked at a few things. For one, we looked at previous economic hardships. So for instance, 9/11 and the 2008 housing crash. And we kind of saw how that affected our portfolio and our loan loss reserve, and used that to gauge what we might need to do during this time. We also spoke to our loan clients to see what effect it was having on their portfolio, because what affects them will eventually affect us. So we have to be informed about the realities of their situations. And finally, we analyzed our financials and our current financial standing to determine what we could feasibly do and reasonably do during this economic hardship to make sure we survive and are still around after. There's a question, should I answer it? Or are we waiting?
Yeah, you can go ahead and answer, Alexandra, if you want, or Crystal or I can step in too.
We're applying the 10% COVID rating across all of the loans in our portfolio. And I'll explain a little bit more why on the next slide and the reasoning behind it. But yes, it's across the board. Okay, so this kind of shows the different COVID-19 risk rating methodologies. So as in the previous slide, we came up with the 10%. And these are a few ways where you can come up with your own risk ratings for COVID-19. So the first way you can do that is on an individual basis. So with that, you would speak with each of your borrowers and develop a specific rating for them based on their current situation and past loan performance. So you take it person by person, loan by loan. And this is the most time intensive, but it provides the most exact ratings because you can get one-on-one feedback and see what you expect based on that individual's situation. Now, another way to do that is by sector. With that, you develop ratings based on the sectors in your portfolio. So for instance, one sector would be consumer, and then small business, housing, emergency. And this allows you to adjust according to how areas of your community are being affected by the economic climate and how different sectors of your loan portfolio are being affected. So for instance, maybe the housing market and your housing loans in your portfolio aren't being very affected. So you can either, leave that risk rating the same or increase it, but just not as much. But then if you look at your consumer loans, that might be having a really big impact. So you can increase your risk rating and your reserve allocations accordingly. And the final one I want to talk about is the blanket policy. Now, this is the one that Oweesta actually used. And on that, you develop a rating for all your loans across the board. This keeps it consistent and easy to manage, but it's best to only use this method if you lend in one sector. So for instance, Oweesta, we do intermediary loans. That's all we do. So we can kind of gauge across the board that'll be a little similar. So you can do it by that, or if your loan portfolio has a historical strength. So you know what your loan clients are like, you know what you can expect, and you have a strong historical proof of this, and it just makes your estimate and of the percentage you need to use more reasonable, and you can be a little more certain in it.
Yeah, so I'm curious, what are the folks that are on the line, what are they doing? Has anybody adjusted their loan loss reserve? I'd love to see folks sharing in the chat what they've been doing. And in the meantime, I'll just add on the sector. It's not just, it is, of course, the types of lending products that you might have, but you could also, for example, if you were just a small business lender, you know, be looking at the sectors of your individual businesses, right? So you could be saying, oh, the construction, all my construction loans are kind of doing this, and all my ag loans are looking like this. And so it could also be even not just the loan products themselves, but it could also be specific sectors. Maybe you have geographic sectors, right? So maybe you lend in Montana, but you also lend in other states, and some of those other states are being hit harder. And so you'd want to reserve more in those other states where your other loans are. So anyway, just wanted to add that. And then if anybody wants to add in the why we go on in the webinar chat function, what they're doing, I think everyone would be very interested to hear what their fellow native CDFIs are doing. If anyone is willing to share.
So the other thing I would like to add to this is our methodology behind the crisis rating is kind of subject to change. A big factor in us determining the 10% rating was what our financial statements could absorb this year without suffering a huge loss. Because as you all know, it's really important that we continue to grow unrestricted net assets. And if you were to operate at a loss, the unrestricted net assets would decrease due to that loss. So a big factor in determining what we could absorb was our current financial situation. And Alex kind of alluded to this earlier in her presentation, but I kind of wanted to explain that a little bit further. So we were able to project out what we estimated our income and expenses to be for the rest of this fiscal year, and then what we could absorb as an additional expense to our loan loss provision. So that also played a factor in that crisis rating. So if you are going to institute a crisis rating or a rating in response to COVID-19, make sure you look at your financials and kind of do a little evaluation and a little analysis to see what you could absorb. And then also, this is subject to change. So, you know, once we get into next year and we have a little bit of better idea of what this pandemic has done to our loan portfolio and our native CDFI's portfolios, you know, we may have to adjust that number upward, depending on how this all pans out, and if people are able to, you know, get back to work, if things open up fully again, or are we going to be under restrictions and having to operate at half capacity in our restaurants and other businesses for long periods of time, you know, if there's a second wave and a second shutdown of everything. So all those will be, you know, factors that we'll have to kind of determine as time goes on, because none of us really know at this point exactly what's going to happen. So all we're kind of doing is we're kind of just doing what we feel not only comfortable with right now, but trying to do the analysis as best we can based on the information that we have currently. So 2 months from now, 3 months from now, things might change. You know, everyone might get back to work, things might open up fully, and the economy starts, you know, really kicking off again. And we might then be able to adjust that crisis rating down instead of upward. But it really depends on, you know, what's going to happen, you know, in the next, you know, 6, 8, 12 months down the road. So I do want to kind of just elaborate on that a little bit on determining, you know, that crisis rating.
Yeah, thank you for that, Flo. I think we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so we're just circling back to our example of our loan loss reserve after our COVID-19 crisis rating. So as you can see, we increase the risk rating and the percentage to 10% for all loans, and our reserve has increased accordingly, so that we're better prepared for losses and unforeseen events during this uncertain time. So you can see, even though they're all different loans, we just did the blanket policy and did 10% all the way down. while you're evaluating this, and like Flo said, this is subject to change at any time. So just continually look at it and adjust as you need. Also be aware of what's happening in your area, in your community, because what's happening there will inform what might happen to your loan portfolio. Also keep an eye on the horizon. So don't panic or have knee-jerk reactions that might end up hurting you in the future. You know, consult with your board, your leadership, your committee, and make sure you're doing what you're comfortable with and what's best for you in your CDFI. Do either of you have anything to add on that?
I don't, Alexandra. I think that was good.
Okay. All right, then we can go to the next slide now.
We have a question in the Q&A section, actually.
Yeah, I see that, and I will get to that and when I get to my section.
Okay.
So this, I guess, is the beginning of my session, and so I'm going to go ahead and we do have a question, as Brian mentioned, in our chat, and I will get to that when I kind of get to more relevant slides in that regard. So just if we could just be a little bit patient, I definitely will answer the question. So this slide just talks about the effects of a loan loss reserve on your balance sheet and your income statement. So your loan loss reserve is a contra account, so it appears as a deduction under your loans receivable. So your loans receivable regular balance on a balance sheet is a debit balance, so it's a positive number. And the loan loss reserve, being a contra account, is the opposite, which means it shows up as a credit on your balance sheet. So that goes in line with what we previously explained, and that's how it kind of lowers or adjusts the value of your balance sheet and of your loans receivable to a more realistic number in the event that you do experience losses. So the next one on the income statement, your loan loss reserve contra account on your balance sheet appears on the P&L as, a lot of people call it provision for loss expense. Some people call it loan loss reserve expense. So there's no like really set word for what it needs to be really, but just it appears as an expense basically. So as your loan loss reserve goes up or down, there's an increase or decrease recognized as an expense on your income statement. And really what this does is it smooths the losses over a period of time as it pertains to your net income. And then, as we mentioned, the reason that's so important is because your net income is a direct correlation to an increase or decrease in your net assets at the end of your accounting period. And then next slide, please, Brian. So these two slides show the balance sheet income statement based on the original pre-COVID loan loss reserve, which we had calculated with our different risk ratings at 7,525. So as you will see, the 7,525 for loan loss reserve, it appears as a contra asset account. So it's taking away from your loans receivable and giving you a net loans receivable amount. So it's decreasing that value. On the income statement side, under expenses, you know, in addition to our other expenses, you'll see that provision for losses appearing and then being calculated into your total expenses, and therefore reducing your income appropriately to the net income of the 37,000. And then next slide, Brian. So we're going to talk about the effects on your financial statements with a crisis rating. And you can go ahead and advance, Brian. So This shows, again, kind of a reiteration of a prior slide where it shows our prior COVID-19 risk rating in our loan loss reserve, and then what it's going to look like at June 30th, which is after we've applied the crisis rating and the new 10%. So as you can see, it goes up significantly from that 7,525 to the 27,500. Next, Brian. And this is the effect on the balance sheet. So you had the original one at 7525 on December 31st, 2019, and then by the end of the fiscal year, you're going to have to increase it to the 27,500. So the valuation of your net loans receivable goes from 267,000 to 247,000. So a difference of approximately a little over 20,000. And so these are just hypothetical numbers, but kind of envision, envision these numbers on your portfolio, whatever that amount is, whether it's 5 million, 10 million, 18 million. Imagine the significant impact if we were using like real numbers here instead of just hypothetical numbers to make this easier to explain and simpler to understand. So when you're talking a larger loan portfolio, that amount is huge, or could potentially be huge. And therefore it kind of goes back to what I said earlier, is that when you're doing this, definitely make sure you evaluate your financial situation and where you're at and how much you can, reasonably absorb without potentially throwing yourself into a loss situation where you reduce your net assets. Next, Brian. So this shows the effect on your income statement. So you can see that, it goes from a net income of 37,000 to a net income of only 17,000. So again, the little over $20,000 adjustment that we made in order to increase the loan loss reserve. So it really does, have a huge bearing and a huge effect on your net income. So always, kind of be careful. On the flip side of this, if at some point down the road, you're able to lower that, or say, for example, go back to your original risk rating system and get rid of that crisis rating or that increased rating, when you lower your loan loss reserve, then if that were to happen, instead of increase it, then you would be crediting an expense account. You would be crediting that provision for losses. So then it gets added back into your income and is reflective of your net income. So if in fact you didn't experience any losses after applying a crisis rating and things got better and you no longer had a need for that crisis rating, you can recover some of those expenses that you had originally written off in a later year or a later accounting time frame. Next, Brian. So now we're going to talk about write-offs and the effects of those on your financial statements. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. So this shows you a hypothetical write-off situation where we're going to, loan number one has gone bad and we feel like there's no way that we're going to recover loan number one. So we're going to write loan number one off. And loan number one was assigned the crisis rating, and the loan loss reserve dollar amount that was applicable to that rating was $1,500, so 10% of the $15,000. So can you advance to the next slide, Brian? So what we're going to do is we're going to take that $50,000 and we're going to remove that, 15,000, not 50. We're going to remove that from loans receivable. We're writing that off, so we have to take it out of our loans receivable. So that automatically reduces our loans receivable to $260,000. Then we're also going to shrink our loan loss reserve. And I do have to apologize for this, but there's an error on this slide. We would only be reducing our loan loss reserve for the amount of loan loss reserve that was applicable to that loan. we wouldn't write off the entire amount to loan loss reserve at this point. And then can you go ahead and advance to the next slide? So the next one is another hypothetical scenario where we're going to write off loan number 4 because loan number 4 has now gone bad. And we're really, in real life scenario, we're absolutely hoping that we don't have to write any of these off, right? But in the event that COVID-19 does pan out where we are suffering some losses, we are kind of trying to give, you know, these scenarios. So if we can advance to the next slide. So again, we're going to have to reduce our accounts receivable by the $10,000, and then we also have an additional adjustment to our loan loss reserve account to absorb those losses. And then can you advance to the next slide, please? So this is where we're going to talk about how you're going to replenish your loan loss reserve after you have written these things off. And we'll talk about it both ways. We'll talk about it in the event that we're going to replenish it, and then we're also going to talk about when we can like readjust it if indeed we didn't have any losses. So here, after those 2 loans were written off, we now have a portfolio of only $250,000, and with the 10% risk rating applied for the crisis rating, that leaves a total of $25,000. Well, we had already taken out the 2 loans that were had gone bad, so we have to increase, or we have to make sure that our ending balance in our loan loss reserve is $25,000. Next slide, please. So after the write-offs, we had $2,500, and then we need $25,000. So we have to increase the loan loss reserve by $22,500, which means we have to expense $22,500 to our loan loss provision. And by doing that, that then reduces our net assets by $22,500. And the next slide, please. Can't remember if there's another one after this. Okay, yeah. So this shows the effects on the income statement. So after we wrote the loans off, our loan loss reserve was down to $2,500, and then we have to increase it by the $22,500 in order to bring that back up for a total of $25,000. So as you can see, in this instance, it did affect the net income in the same accounting period. Because of having to expense that additional provision for the losses, it threw us into a loss situation where our net income is now a loss of $17,500. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is actually Crystal's slide, but I'm going to take this time to address the question now in the chat. And her question was, that normally they only keep an accrual loan loss allowance and not a cash loan loss allowance reserve. So if they wanted to start a cash reserve in response to COVID instead of a crisis rating, how would they do that accounting wise? So basically the difference from accounting wise from an accrued loan loss reserve to a cash loan loss reserve is that accrued loan loss reserve, as we've just kind of illustrated here, affects both the balance sheet and the income statement. So there's a contra asset account on the balance sheet, and then there's an expense account on the income statement that are both affected by an accrual loan loss reserve. And both of those accounts are also affected if you write off a loan, or if by chance you end up being able to lower or change your risk rating back to a normal risk rating and are able to lower your loan loss reserve. It affects both of those accounts, the contra asset account, which is on the balance sheet, and then your expense account on the income statement. With a cash loan loss reserve, it only affects your balance sheet. So the way you set this up is, number one, to have a cash reserve of any kind, whether it's for operations or a loan loss reserve, it has to be board approved by your board of directors. and you literally do a set aside account. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate bank account per se, like a real life bank account, but it needs to be a separate account on your balance sheet where you are taking out cash from operations or cash from lending or cash from another source, and you are specifically setting that aside as a cash reserve for loan loss. So then what happens is it has no effect at all on your income statement. So it's only balance sheet. So you'll see it as a bank account, and then you'll see it as a reserve account. So both on the asset side of the balance sheet. And then if in fact you need to write a loan off under this scenario, instead of applying it to your loan loss reserve, I would first recommend that you always apply it to your accrued loan loss reserve. And the only time you would dip into this cash reserve is if your write-offs were so significant that you were not able to meet your funder obligations. If you were not able to meet your funder obligations, whether that's principal payment to your funder or interest payments to your funder or your investor, that's when you would use this cash reserve in order to compensate for those write-offs coming off of your balance sheet and out of your loan portfolio and still having obligations to meet. So this would be the next step after your accrued loan loss reserve was used. The other way you could potentially do it is you could just, so there's two different kinds of expense reports or expense line items that you'll see on an income statement. One is the one we've already explained for the loan loss provision expense, but there's also another expense that you'll often see in many income statements for in our industry, and that's a bad debt expense. So in this instance, if you had already wiped out your accrued loan loss reserve and you had nothing left there, and you still had additional write-offs that needed to go towards this cash reserve, you would go ahead and expense that amount to bad debt expense. And then that's a debit when you have an expense on an income statement. So the credit side of this would go against this cash reserve, because this cash reserve is a positive number on your balance sheet with a debit balance. And once you take away from that, you have to credit it in order to lower it. And that's how that would work in relationship to an accrued loan loss reserve versus a cash loan loss reserve. So I hope that answered that question for you. And if you have additional questions, go ahead and fill them out and send them out through the chat. And I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal now, and she's going to close out this webinar for us.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much. I love when she talks accounting. It's so cool. Yeah, so I just want to reiterate, when we talk about write-offs, I think it's important to stress that write-off is an accounting function, and it should be done when it says you're going to do it in your policy. So most days, I think for most policies I see, that's at maybe 120 days delinquent or 90 days delinquent. There's usually it says in your policies when you're supposed to do the write-off, and you want to do that, and that's an accounting function. But I just want to one of the things I see so much from our native CDFIs, some of us work in tribal government systems where in court systems, especially now where it's very difficult to collect. Maybe they were closed for a while or are going to be closed for a while. Just because you write off a loan does not mean that you are stopping trying to collect on it. So that's the accounting function of that. If you are able to recover additional funds back from the loan after it's been written off, you can of course have a recovery and have that be reflected into your financial statements as well. So I just want to reiterate that. I know some of us are struggling with, might have slow collection processes, and we see kind of lingering delinquencies there, and so I just want to encourage us to do write-offs in accordance with what our policy said.
Crystal, can I just add a couple things to that?
Absolutely.
So when we're talking about recoveries, if in fact you do write off a loan and you recover that at a later time, the accounting function for that is kind of the opposite almost of the write-off. So if you do have a recovery, you can recognize it two ways. One is you can have an income account for recovery of bad debts, which gets added into your income, actually gets added into your net assets in the end. But the other way to do it is you can, if you had write-offs previously in the year and you had to expense additional loan loss reserve provision or bad debt expense, like I used in the example of a cash reserve, you would just credit that expense for that amount that you recovered to lower that expense. And I know that can kind of be like a little bit confusing, but you can do it both ways. You can recognize it as revenue coming back into the organization because in essence, that's what it is. You expensed things previously, either through a loan loss provision expense or through a bad debt expense when you wrote it off. So that reduced your net income. Anytime you have an expense, it reduces your net income. And so that when you're bringing it back into the org under a recovery situation, you can just go ahead, like I said, add it back into income or go ahead and credit back in expense, which ultimately has the same effect on your financial statements.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Flo. And then I would also add that we have thrown a lot of accounting terminology and other kind of best practices at you. I will say it, and we'll say it again and again and again. If you have any questions, if you're going to do this on your financial statements or your, I think so many of our native CDFIs have such good histories. So few. I'm amazed, in all honesty, with how few write-offs our industry have, given the context. Of some of our lending programs. We really do a great job as an industry in this area. So some of us aren't as familiar with write-offs. This might be a new world for us. So all that to say, Oweesta's here. If you have questions, Flo has answers. I volunteer her. No, I'm just kidding. Well, kind of, but yeah, we're here for you. So don't hesitate to reach out. If you're trying to get all those figured out. But I just want to kind of circle back on why this is important. First of all, we talk about it, and we've said it a few times, but it's important to properly reflect the value of your portfolio. And then, it's smooth losses of your income statement over time, right? If you have been, over time, you've had a loan that's going bad progressively and you have increased your reserve on that loan, by the time you go to write off, maybe you've already reserved 50% of it. You've already smoothed that loss so that you're not losing the whole value of the loan all at once. So that is very, very helpful. It'll increase the security in your portfolio, and it attracts and maintains investors to show that you really understand the value of your portfolio, that you can accurately estimate what's going to be happening in your portfolio over time. Flo's favorite, it makes our auditors happy to have a good system. And then, in the best world, it'll provide a safety net in a time of crisis. So very important right now. Final slide. Brian, can you, okay. One thing I did want to reflect on is historically with our native CDFI industry, we have over-reserved. And many CDFIs do this as well. And the reason for that is, in a perfect world, your loan loss reserve should actually, your percentage of how much your loan that you're reserving at should actually equal your write-offs over time. And what I always am amazed at when I get to see our financial statements, sometimes I'll see groups that maybe have a 15% loan loss reserve and a 0.5% write-off rate over time, right? So those aren't equaling. It's not actually reflecting. And when you over reserve, you're reducing your portfolio assets, right? So you're not actually estimating your portfolio, the value of your portfolio, and that can make it difficult to attract investors. And the reason for that, is you're going to have it. This will be where that is coming out of, right? Is as Flo discussed, is your net assets. And so you want to have and document strong net assets. It'll help you leverage additional funds. And so it's making you appear weaker than you actually are. But especially in this environment, under reserving is also a challenge, because then when you do have write-offs happen, as we all do, you have to take a big hit on your balance sheet in a way that is problematic. So it's really important to try to find the sweet spot there. And I know it's especially interesting and challenging during these times, but I do know from talking with so many of you that you are in constant contact with your communities, you're having these conversations, you have probably a reasonable understanding of what's happening in your communities. I also recommend for those of you who have networks to reach out and ask what other people are doing in their networks, what they're seeing, what's happening in their region among their different partners, to get a sense of what other CDFIs are doing. We found this very useful at Oweesta. We talked to some of our other intermediary partners and said, hey, what are you seeing? What do you think is going to happen? And then whether or not we're all right, at least when we give our financial statements to our funders, we'll all be kind of doing the same thing. So we'll at least be in line with what's happening with the rest of the industry. And we're very hopeful that we have over reserved, but we'll see over time, right? The other thing I want to just say, sometimes we get the question of, well, we don't really have, we don't have big unrestricted net assets to use to expense our loan loss reserve. We want to increase it, but where do we get that money? We've also at Oweesta found a lot of our funders were willing to do grant amendments to allow us to increase our loan loss reserve during COVID-19. So I'd encourage you to connect with some of your partners there. And then also, as a gentle reminder, those of you who receive NACA FA, which is to say a financial assistance from NACA, loan loss reserve expense is an eligible use under the CDFI fund awards. So there are resources there if you don't have a big pool of unrestricted net assets to use to expense out for your loan loss reserve. So anything to add or any questions that we can have here? We're already a few minutes over, but anything that anyone wanted to ask or? Oh, Capri says, thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. Thank you all for listening. This was so fun. As fun as accounting statements and loan loss reserve in a crisis can be, I suppose.
And I just wanted to add again, Crystal already said it, but I just want to throw it out there again that if any of you have any questions about your accounting for loan loss reserve, write-offs, or even recovery of bad debts, definitely feel free to reach out to me.
All right. Well, thank you all so much.